They were letting her die in the rain. 6-year-old Jennifer was screaming under the red emergency sign, while 3 men stood between her mother and the hospital doors and no one moved. Then a black car stopped. A man in a dark suit stepped out, and in less than 60 seconds, everything, including who was afraid, changed. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The emergency sign bled red across a sky that had forgotten how to be kind. Rain came down in thin, relentless sheets, not the dramatic kind that arrives with thunder and spectacle, but the quiet, grinding kind that soaks through everything slowly, the way certain kinds of suffering do. It pooled in the cracks of the hospital entrance, gathered in the dips of the asphalt, and turned the whole forecourt into a mirror that reflected only broken light. No one was supposed to be standing outside on a night like this, and yet Jennifer Dennis stood on that wet pavement like something the storm had forgotten to carry away. She was 6 years old. She wore a pink cardigan, rose-faded, slightly oversized at the sleeves over a small patterned skirt that clung damp to her knees. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks in uneven strands. Her hands were raised at her sides, small fingers spread open, trembling not from cold, though the cold was real, but from the particular terror that lives only in children who understand that the adult world has stopped making sense. Tears ran freely down her face. She did not wipe them. She had stopped noticing them. What she noticed, what she could not stop noticing, were the 3 men standing between her and the hospital doors. They were not hiding what they were. The first 2 stood shoulder to shoulder in front of the entrance, thick-necked and deliberate, one in a gray jacket, the other in a tan shirt, arms loose at their sides the way men stand when they are comfortable with violence and not in any hurry to use it yet. The third stood slightly apart, younger-faced, in a blue hoodie bent slightly at the shoulder, not from weakness, but from the particular posture of a man delivering a message he has delivered before and expects to deliver again. Behind them, through the glass doors, the hospital corridor glowed pale and indifferent. Doctors moved in there, nurses moved in there, warmth existed in there, and between Jennifer and all of it, those 3 men, unmoving, unmoved. Behind Jennifer, close enough that the child could hear every labored breath, Hannah Dennis stood pressed against the exterior wall of the building. One hand was flat against the glass. The other was pressed hard against her chest over her heart, fingers curled slightly, as if she were trying physically to hold something in place inside her body that was threatening to come apart. Her face was the color of old paper. She was 31 years old and looked, in this moment, like someone much older, not in features, but in the particular exhaustion that accumulates when life has taken more than its fair share without asking permission. Her gray top was darkened with rain across the shoulders. Her jaw was tight. She was not crying. She was somewhere past crying in that quiet, desperate territory where the body is simply trying to survive the next 60 seconds. "Please," Jennifer said again. Her voice was small, but it carried the way a single candle carries in a dark room simply by being the only light. She looked at the man in the gray jacket, then the one in the tan shirt, then the younger one. Her hands came together in front of her chest. "Please, my mom is sick. She needs to go inside. Please just let us." "Kid." The man in the gray jacket didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We already told her. This doesn't change until what's owed is paid. That's not our problem. She can't breathe. Not our problem." Jennifer's chin crumpled. Fresh tears came. She turned back to her mother, and the sight of Hannah, barely standing, hand pressed to her chest, eyes half closed, made the little girl turn back to the men with something that wasn't quite courage, but was the closest thing to it that fear can produce. "Someone will help us," Jennifer said, almost to herself. "Someone will." The man in the tan shirt glanced sideways at his colleague. Something passed between them that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. Nobody moved. The rain kept falling, and then headlights. A sleek black car curved into the hospital forecourt from the far end, moving without hurry. The kind of vehicle that doesn't need to announce itself because everything about it already has. It rolled to a stop near the entrance. The engine cut. A door opened. The man who stepped out was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that a tailored dark suit could contain but not conceal. The suit itself was immaculate despite the rain, jacket buttoned, white shirt open at the collar with no tie, a deliberate absence that somehow made him look more formal, not less. His dark hair was cropped close, neat at the sides. His jaw was set with the particular stillness of someone who processes the world quietly and responds to it decisively. And his hands, both of them, were marked with ink. Tattoos wound from his knuckles upward, disappearing beneath his cuffs. They were not decorative. They were a record. Christian Valdez did not rush. He closed the car door behind him with the calm of a man who had exited vehicles in worse places than this and had always walked away from them. He had been inside the hospital visiting one of his men, a brief, quiet visit, as most of his movements were. He had not expected anything waiting for him outside. He took in the scene in 3 seconds, perhaps less. The girl, the woman against the wall, the 3 men at the doors. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did a barely perceptible shift, like a dial turning 1 click from neutral to engaged. His pace remained even as he moved across the wet asphalt, rainwater catching the red glow of the emergency sign beneath his shoes with every step. Jennifer saw him. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he was, or what men who looked like him meant in neighborhoods like this one. She knew only that he was walking toward them without fear, and that in this moment, that was the only credential that mattered. She ran to him. Her small hand caught the sleeve of his jacket. He stopped, looked down at her dark eyes, unreadable, but present in a way that the other men had not been. Fully present, actually seeing her. "Please," she whispered, tears still falling, voice stripped of everything except the truth. "Those men won't let my mum in." Christian Valdez looked at Jennifer, then at Hannah hand to chest, barely standing, seconds from the floor, then at the 3 men blocking the doors. The red sign pulsed overhead. The rain fell, and the air, the very air between them, changed. Hannah Dennis had not always been a woman who needed saving. There was a version of her not so distant that she couldn't still remember the feeling of it, who woke up before her alarm, who packed Jennifer's lunch with little folded notes tucked inside, who believed, with the particular stubbornness of someone who had chosen love deliberately, that a good life was something you could build with your hands, if you were willing to work hard enough. She had been willing. That had never been the problem. The problem had a name. And 2 years ago, that name had packed a single bag on a Tuesday morning while Jennifer was at nursery, set a key on the kitchen counter without a note, and walked out of their lives as casually as a man leaving a restaurant he had simply decided he didn't enjoy anymore. No argument, no goodbye, no backward glance, just silence and a door that didn't slam, which somehow made it worse. Hannah had stood in the kitchen for a long time after she found that key. She remembered the way the light came through the window. She remembered the coffee still warm in the pot. She remembered thinking, with a strange, hollow clarity, so this is what abandoned feels like. Not like falling, not like an explosion, like a light being switched off in an empty room. She had not told Jennifer the truth for 3 weeks. She had said Daddy was working away. Then she had stopped saying anything at all, because children are far more perceptive than adults give them credit for, and Jennifer had stopped asking which, in its own quiet way, was the most heartbreaking response of all. The months that followed taught Hannah things she had never wanted to know. She learned what it meant to be financially invisible, no joint account she could access, no savings in her name, no credit history that a landlord would trust. She learned the particular humiliation of filling out forms that asked for a second income and having nothing to write. She learned that a hypertension diagnosis, delivered by a doctor with kind eyes and a very short appointment window, was not something the body would wait patiently for her to afford to manage. She took work where she could find it. A supermarket 2 bus rides away, evening cleaning shifts at an office block. Whatever hours didn't overlap with Jennifer's school day, so she wouldn't need to pay for childcare she couldn't afford. She was good at the work. She was reliable. She showed up. But the human body has limits that reliability cannot override. And stress, the kind that sits in your chest at 3 a.m. when the rent is due, and the medication is running low, and your 6-year-old has outgrown her shoes, is not something you can simply decide to put down. Her blood pressure climbed. Her prescription ran out in February, and she stretched the remaining tablets by having them, telling herself it was temporary, that next month would be different. Next month was not different. The apartment they lived in sat on a street that the city had largely decided to forget. Buildings with windows that didn't quite close, pavements that pooled water in the rain, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business and nobody interfered in it because interfering had consequences. And consequences on this street arrived in the form of 3 men who collected debts for a landlord who had never once set foot in one of his own properties. They had come twice before. The first time, they knocked, politely enough, by their standards. The second time, one of them had leaned in the doorframe, while Hannah stood in the entrance with Jennifer behind her in the hallway, and he had said, very quietly, with the particular calm of someone who has never needed to shout, "We don't like coming back a third time, love. It makes us feel unwelcome." She had paid that time. Every penny she had. 2 weeks of groceries gone in a single envelope. Tonight, she had nothing left to give them. It had started in the early evening, a pressure behind her eyes that she recognized and tried to breathe through. Then the heat, spreading up from her chest into her jaw. Then her hands, trembling slightly as she set Jennifer's dinner on the table, hoping the child wouldn't notice. Jennifer noticed. "Mum, your face is wrong." Hannah had laughed a short, unconvincing sound. "I'm fine, baby. Eat your food." But by 7 o'clock, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, unable to lie down because lying down made it worse. One hand pressed flat against her sternum, breathing in careful, measured increments. The chest pain came in waves. Her left arm felt heavy in a way that frightened her. Her vision swam at the edges when she stood. She knew what this was. She had been warned what this was. Jennifer appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, dark eyes wide and reading everything. "We need to go to the hospital," the child said. It was not a question. Hannah wanted to argue. She thought of the cost. She thought of the street outside and who might be on it. She thought of the 3 men and the envelope she no longer had. Then another wave of pain rolled through her chest, and the thought process ended. "Get your cardigan," Hannah said quietly. Jennifer moved fast, faster than any 6-year-old should need to know how to move in an emergency. She found her pink cardigan on the chair. She found her shoes. She came back to her mother and held out her small hand, and Hannah took it, and together they made their way down the stairs of the apartment building and out into the rain. The hospital was 7 minutes away on foot. They made it in 5. And fate, which had already taken so much from Hannah, Dennis had arranged one final obstacle at the door. The same 3 men, waiting, as if they had known. They saw her coming. That was the part that stayed with Jennifer long after the fact, that the men didn't appear suddenly, didn't step out from shadow or surprise them at the last moment. They were simply there, under the red glow of the emergency sign, positioned in front of the glass doors with the ease of men who had been expecting exactly this. The one in the gray jacket spotted Hannah first. His chin lifted. He said something to the one beside him, the broad one in the tan shirt, and that man turned slowly, unhurried, the way people turn when they already know they hold every advantage worth holding. Hannah stopped walking. Her hand tightened around Jennifer's. 7 feet of wet asphalt separated them. It might as well have been a canyon. Hannah. The man in the gray jacket said her name the way people say the names of things they own. Familiar, flat, final. "We've been patient." "My mum is sick." Hannah's voice was controlled, but Jennifer could feel the tremor running through her hand. "I need to get inside. Please just let us through tonight and I will sort the money by." "You said that last week." I know I did. But she needs a doctor right now. Look at her, she can barely." "Not our concern." The man in the tan shirt this time. Heavier voice, less patience in it. "You know how this works. You've always known how this works." The third man, the younger one in the blue hoodie, stood slightly to the side, hands in his pockets, eyes on the ground. He wasn't leading this, but he wasn't stopping it either. And in some ways, Jennifer would later think, that was worse. Hannah took 1 step forward. The man in the gray jacket moved 1 step left, closing the gap. Not aggressive. Not yet. Simply immovable. The glass doors were right there. Jennifer could see the corridor through them. Fluorescent light. A reception desk. A nurse crossing the frame in blue scrubs. Completely unaware of what was happening 10 feet from where she walked, Jennifer let go of her mother's hand. She stepped forward. "Please." She looked up at the man in the gray jacket. He was enormous from down here. A wall with a face, and she felt her whole body shaking, but she did not step back. "My mum has chest pain. Her arm hurts. She needs to go inside right now. Please just move." The man looked down at her. His expression didn't shift. "Go home, little girl. We don't have a doctor at home." Jennifer's voice cracked on the last word. "She needs one here. Why won't you just—" "Because your mother owes money. Simple. Delivered without cruelty or heat, which somehow made it colder than either. When she pays, she can go wherever she likes." Jennifer turned back to her mother. Hannah was leaning against the exterior wall now, the flat of her palm pressed to the glass, her other hand tight against her chest. Her breathing had become audible, short, effortful, each exhale slightly too careful. Her eyes found Jennifer's, and in them was a terror she was trying very hard to keep from becoming visible, for her daughter's sake. She was failing. Jennifer felt something happen inside her chest, not pain, but something adjacent to it, a tearing open. The particular anguish that arrives when you are a child, and you understand for the first time that your parent is not invincible. She turned back to the men. "Someone help us!" She didn't plan to say it. It came out of her the way things come out when the body bypasses the mind entirely. Her voice rang across the forecourt, into the rain, toward the few people drifting at the edges of the car park, a man loading something into a boot, a woman on her phone near the corner, a couple walking toward the far entrance. They looked up. Every single one of them looked up, and every single one of them looked away. The man near the boot found something in his car that needed attending to. The woman on her phone turned slightly, repositioning herself so that the scene was no longer in her eyeline. The couple walked faster, heads down, choosing the far entrance with sudden great purpose. The rain fell. The doors didn't open. Jennifer stood in the gap between her mother and the three men and felt the full, crushing weight of what it meant to be small in a world that had decided not to intervene. She begged again. She was not proud or strategic about it. She simply begged, the way only children can, completely, without dignity, without calculation, with every available piece of themselves. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll bring the money tomorrow myself. I'll carry it here. Jennifer," Hannah's voice, quiet but firm, even now, even here. "Come back here, baby. Mum, come here." Jennifer retreated to her mother's side. Hannah put one arm around her, pulled her close. Jennifer could feel Hannah's heartbeat too fast, too hard, drumming against her ribs like something trying to break out. The man in the gray jacket watched them with the expression of someone waiting for a meeting to conclude. Hannah closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, she tried once more. She is 6 years old. Her voice broke cleanly on the number, like a bone. 6 years old, and she is watching her mother. She stopped, steadied. "I am asking you, as a human being, let us through." Silence. The man in the gray jacket looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, and that deliberate turning away was the cruelest thing Jennifer had ever witnessed. Not a shout, not a shove. Just a man deciding that a woman in crisis and her terrified child were simply not worth the continued expenditure of his attention. Jennifer's hands came up in front of her chest. She didn't know what to do with them. She felt her mouth opening again, another plea forming, though she had no idea what words were left that she hadn't already used. And then she heard it. A car door, closing. Unhurried, she turned, and saw him. He was not what Jennifer expected. She didn't know what she had expected. Exactly someone rushing, perhaps. Someone alarmed. Someone whose face announced that they had seen what was happening and had decided it was wrong and were arriving to say so loudly. This man was none of those things. He walked across the wet forecourt with the particular, unhurried calm of someone who had never once needed to hurry to be taken seriously. Each step was measured, deliberate. The rain fell around him, and he moved through it as though it had simply decided not to bother him. His dark suit was immaculate, jacket buttoned, not a single concession to the weather, and beneath it, a white shirt open at the collar, no tie, as though someone had begun to dress formally and then stopped at the exact right moment. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way the suit contained but could not disguise. His jaw was set, dark with shadow, and his face angular, still, the face of a man who had learned long ago that expression was something you chose, rather than something that happened to you gave nothing away. But it was his hands that Jennifer noticed most. Even from here, in the rain, she could see the ink. Tattoos wound across both hands, over his knuckles, disappearing up beneath his cuffs, dark patterns that spoke of a life lived in places and decisions that most people only ever heard about secondhand. They were not the hands of a man who existed in the same world as the one Jennifer's mother had always tried to build for them. And yet, he had stopped. His eyes had found the scene, her mother against the wall, the three men at the doors, Jennifer standing between them, and he had stopped walking for exactly 1 second. Just one. Long enough for something behind his eyes to shift, quietly, like a tide changing direction underwater where no one could see it happening. Then he kept walking. Toward them. Jennifer moved before she made a decision to move. Her feet carried her across the wet asphalt in small, urgent steps, her cardigan sleeves hanging past her wrists, her skirt damp and clinging, tears still tracking down her cheeks that she no longer had the capacity to feel. She crossed the distance between them in seconds, and her hand, small, cold, shaking, reached up and caught the sleeve of his jacket. He stopped, looked down, and the thing that Jennifer would remember for the rest of her life. Not the confrontation that came after, not the men hitting the ground, not the hospital doors finally opening, but this, the way he looked at her. Not through her, the way the others had. Not past her, the way the bystanders in the car park had. Not down at her with impatience or dismissal or the particular blankness of adults who have decided a child's emergency is not their emergency. He looked directly at her. Dark eyes, unreadable in their depth, but utterly, completely present. Seeing her. All of her. The tears and the pink cardigan and the shaking hands and the terror underneath all of it that she had been carrying alone for the last 40 minutes. Jennifer's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Please." Her fingers tightened on his sleeve. "Those men won't let my mum in." He didn't respond immediately. He looked at her for one long moment, the kind of moment that compresses time, that exists slightly outside the normal rhythm of seconds, and then his gaze moved, slowly and deliberately, to Hannah. Hannah had not pushed herself off the wall. She didn't have the strength for it. She stood with her palm flat against the glass, chest heaving in shallow increments, left hand still pressed hard over her heart. Her face was the color of the fog sitting above the car park. When she met his eyes, she didn't speak. There was nothing performative left in her, no energy remaining for appearances or explanations. She simply looked at him with the raw, unguarded desperation of a woman who had run completely out of options. Something moved across Christian Valdez's face. It was not pity. It was too quiet for pity, and too hard at its edges. It was something older than that, something that lived deeper in a person, and did not require a reason or a justification to activate. Recognition, perhaps, of what injustice looks like when it is stripped of all its justifications and stands revealed for exactly what it is. His gaze moved last to the three men. The man in the gray jacket had noticed him by now. His posture had shifted, not retreating, but recalibrating, reassessing. He looked Christian over with the practiced eye of someone whose profession required accurate assessments of threat, and Jennifer watched something flicker in his expression that he was working to keep from becoming visible. It looked, she thought, very much like the first small seed of doubt. Christian looked down at Jennifer one final time. His expression remained still, composed, but his voice, when it came, was low and even, and carried the particular weight of words that don't need volume to land. "Stay with your mother." He said it gently. Not a dismissal, a protection. He was placing her somewhere safe in the geometry of what was about to happen, removing her from the space he was about to occupy. Jennifer released his sleeve. She walked back to Hannah. She took her mother's hand. Hannah's fingers wrapped around hers immediately, reflexively, cold and trembling, and they stood together against the wall and watched. Christian Valdez straightened his jacket once, a small, precise gesture. Then he turned toward the three men blocking the hospital doors and walked toward them with the same measured, unhurried step with which he had crossed the entire forecourt, as if he had all the time in the world, as if the outcome had already been decided, and this was simply the formality of it playing out. The man in the gray jacket opened his mouth. Christian didn't stop walking. The red emergency sign pulsed overhead. Jennifer held her mother's hand so tightly her knuckles ached, and the air between the two sides thick with rain and cold, and the specific electricity that gathers before something irreversible held its breath. "This doesn't concern you." The man in the gray jacket said it with the confidence of someone who had used that line before and watched people accept it. "Step back. Apologize, even. Find somewhere else to be." Christian Valdez didn't stop walking. He closed the remaining distance between them at the same unhurried pace, and came to a stop close enough that the man in the gray jacket had to make a choice, hold his ground, or take a step back. He held it. Barely. "She's going inside," Christian said. No preamble, no negotiation, no raising of his voice to match the register the situation seemed to demand. Just 4 words, delivered with the flat, absolute certainty of a man stating a fact about the weather. The man in the gray jacket stared at him, processing, recalibrating again, this time more urgently. Up close, Christian Valdez was something different than he had appeared from across the forecourt. Not just the size of him, though that was real enough. It was something less tangible. The quality of his stillness, the way his eyes held contact without effort or aggression, as though he had nothing to prove and had known that for a very long time. "I don't know who you think you are," the man said, slower now. some of the original certainty bleeding at the edges. "But this is a private matter. Walk away." "It stopped being private," Christian said quietly, "when you put a sick woman and her child in the rain." A beat of silence. Then the man in the tan shirt, the broader one, who had said little and positioned himself as the physical argument in this conversation, stepped forward and shoved Christian once, palm flat against his chest. Not full force, a test, the kind of push that asks a question. It was the last question he asked. What happened next was not cinematic in the way that fights in films are cinematic. No slow motion, no dramatic pause before impact. It was fast and controlled and appallingly efficient in the way that things are when they are performed by someone for whom this is not an exercise in anger but simply a task being completed. Christian moved inside the second push before it landed. One hand caught the man's extended wrist. The other drove forward at the elbow, a short, precise movement, and the large man went down with a sound that was less a shout and more a single syllable of pure surprise, his knee hitting the wet asphalt before the rest of him followed. He did not get up. The man in the gray jacket reacted a half-second later, lunging forward, leading with his right shoulder, committed. Christian sidestepped with the minimal movement of someone who had read the intention before the body had finished forming it, caught the back of the man's jacket, and redirected him with a controlled force that ended with the man face first against the exterior wall beside the hospital doors. Christian held him there for exactly 2 seconds, forearm across the back of his shoulders, voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Don't." He released him. The man slid slowly down the wall and sat on the wet ground, breathing hard, reassembling himself in the way of someone whose body has just received information that his ego had not prepared him for. The third man, the younger one in the blue hoodie, who had stood to the side through all of it, never quite fully committing to either leadership or conscience, was already backing away. 2 steps. 3. His hands came up, palms out, the universal language of a man who has just seen something recalibrate his understanding of the evening's risk profile entirely. Christian looked at him. Just looked. "Walk away," he said, quiet, even, the same tone he might use to close a door. The young man turned and walked. Fast. Not quite running the last remaining shred of dignity, but close enough that the distinction was largely academic. Silence. The rain fell. The 2 men on the ground stayed on the ground. Christian straightened. He adjusted his jacket cuffs, both of them, one then the other, with the same precise, unhurried composure with which he had arrived, as though the previous 40 seconds had been a minor interruption in an otherwise unremarkable evening. Then he turned around. Hannah had pushed herself off the wall. She was standing upright barely, one hand still braced against the glass, but standing. Her eyes were fixed on Christian with an expression that Jennifer would later struggle to find the exact word for. Not gratitude yet, not relief. Something rawer than either. The look of a person who has been certain, for a very long time, that no one was coming, and has just been proven wrong in a way the heart hasn't caught up to yet. Jennifer was still holding her mother's hand. She had watched the whole thing without making a sound, frozen, breath held, small body pressed against her mother's side. Now, as Christian walked back toward them, she exhaled. The sound was shaky, the held breath of the last 10 minutes releasing all at once. Christian looked at Hannah. His voice returned to its normal register, low, direct, clear. "Can you walk?" Hannah nodded. Small, honest. He moved to her left side, not grabbing, not pulling, simply positioning himself close enough to be useful if she needed it, and turned toward the hospital doors. They opened automatically as they approached. Warm light spilled out across the wet forecourt. The smell of antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular indoor warmth of a building that existed for the specific purpose of keeping people alive. Hannah crossed the threshold. Jennifer crossed it beside her, still holding her hand, still trembling slightly, looking up at her mother's face as though verifying something she needed to be certain of. Hannah was inside. A nurse appeared at the reception desk, looked up, took one look at Hannah's face, and the hand pressed to her chest, and was already moving around the desk before anyone had said a word. "I need a doctor," Christian said, with quiet authority. "Now. Hypertensive crisis. She needs to be seen immediately." The nurse didn't hesitate. Neither did the doctor, who appeared 30 seconds later. Hannah was eased into a wheelchair. Jennifer kept hold of her hand until the last possible moment, until the corridor turned, and the medical team closed around her mother with the efficient, purposeful urgency that Jennifer had been trying to produce, with nothing but her voice for the last half hour. Then her mother was gone around the corner, and Jennifer stood alone in the corridor. The tears came differently now, not the desperate, pleading tears of the forecourt, but the tears of a child whose body is releasing something enormous that it has been holding in place through sheer necessity. She sank into a plastic chair against the wall, put her small hands together in her lap, and wept. Christian Valdez stood nearby. He didn't speak, didn't move closer, didn't offer hollow words about everything being fine. He simply stayed. Present. Still. Certain in the way that certain people are not because they know the outcome, but because they have decided that whatever the outcome, it will not be faced alone. The red emergency light outside pulsed once through the glass. Fear, on this night, had changed sides. The hospital had its own kind of silence, not the silence of absence. It was never truly quiet in a place like this, with its distant beeping monitors and soft-soled shoes on linoleum and the low, urgent murmur of people who worked in proximity to crisis every single day. But there was a silence that existed underneath all of that, specific to waiting. The silence of people sitting in plastic chairs with their hands in their laps and their eyes on corridor corners, measuring time not in minutes but in the space between footsteps. Jennifer knew this silence now. She sat in the chair against the wall where she had collapsed, her pink cardigan still damp at the shoulders, her small hands pressed flat on her knees. The tears had slowed. Not stopped, they still came in quiet, irregular intervals, as though her body hadn't quite finished processing everything it had stored up over the past hour, but the desperate, drowning quality of them had passed. What remained was something quieter and, in its own way, harder to bear. Waiting. She stared at the corridor corner around which her mother had disappeared. Christian Valdez stood several feet away, near the wall opposite. He had not sat down. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, jacket still immaculate despite everything, his gaze moving periodically between the corridor and the child in the chair, with a quality of attention that was protective without being intrusive. He had not left. Jennifer had noticed that. In the first few minutes after her mother was taken through, she had half expected to look up and find him gone, return to whatever world he had stepped out of when he exited his car. Men like him, in her limited but surprisingly astute understanding of the world, did not generally linger in hospital waiting areas for the benefit of children they had never met before tonight, but he stayed. A nurse had appeared briefly to take Jennifer's details, her mother's name, her date of birth, whether she had existing conditions, whether she was on medication. Jennifer had answered every question with a precision and composure that made the nurse pause and look at her with an expression that mixed professional efficiency with something more personal, more troubled. The child answered like someone who had been the most responsible person in the room for longer than was right. Christian had listened without comment. When the nurse asked if there was a guardian present, he had said, quietly and without particular emphasis, "I'll stay with her." And something in the way he said it, not an offer, simply a statement of what was already true, made the nurse nod and move on without further inquiry. Now the corridor was quiet again. Jennifer looked up at him. "Is she going to be okay?" Christian met her eyes. He did not offer her the automatic reassurance that adults so often reach for with children, the reflexive. "Of course she will. That costs nothing because it promises nothing while pretending to promise everything." He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The doctors here are good," he said. "She's in the right place. That matters more than almost anything else right now." Jennifer absorbed this. Turned it over. "It matters that we got here in time?" "Yes. We almost didn't." "But you did." A pause. "You got her here. That was you, Jennifer." She looked at him for a long moment, this large, still, tattooed man in an expensive suit, who had dismantled 3 men on a rainy forecourt, and was now standing in a hospital corridor telling a 6-year-old that she had done something that mattered. Her chin crumpled once. She pressed her lips together against it. "I was scared," she admitted. The confession came out small, as though admitting it might retroactively undermine the getting here in time part. "I know," Christian said. "You were scared and you did it anyway." He paused again, considering his words with the care of a man unused to speaking to children, but unwilling to speak to this one carelessly. "That's not the absence of bravery, Jennifer. That's what bravery actually is." She looked down at her hands. Nodded once, processing. The next 40 minutes passed in the particular suspended way that waiting passes, simultaneously endless and compressed. Each minute both too long and somehow behind you, before you fully lived it. Jennifer sat. Christian stood. Occasionally a nurse passed through. Occasionally a sound drifted from somewhere deeper in the building. A door, a voice, the distant percussion of a hospital at work, then footsteps, purposeful ones, coming around the corner. The doctor was a woman in her 40s, dark hair pulled back, reading glasses on top of her head, the expression of someone who had delivered difficult news enough times to have learned how to carry it without letting it land before it needed to. She looked at Jennifer first, then at Christian, then back at Jennifer. She crouched to eye level with the child. "Your mum is stable," she said, and her voice was warm in the way that facts can be warm when they are the right facts at the right moment. She had a hypertensive crisis, her blood pressure was dangerously high, but she arrived in time for us to treat it properly, and she is responding well. Jennifer stared at her. "She's going to recover," the doctor continued. "She'll need to stay with us for monitoring tonight, and she'll need proper treatment going forward, but she is going to be okay." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Jennifer Dennis put her face in her hands and cried. Not the crying of fear or desperation or helplessness. This was entirely different, the release of something enormous that a small body had been holding in place through will alone, the specific grief of relief, which is perhaps the most overwhelming grief of all, because it arrives at the exact moment you finally allow yourself to feel what the danger actually was. Her shoulders shook. Her whole small frame shook. Christian crossed to where she sat. He lowered himself to one knee beside her chair, bringing himself to her level, in the way he had not done on the forecourt closer now, the distance between crisis and quiet having earned it. He placed one hand carefully, gently on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. "You were brave tonight," he said quietly. "Your mum is lucky to have you." Jennifer lifted her face from her hands. Her cheeks were wet. Her eyes were swollen. She looked, in this moment, exactly as young as she was a 6-year-old girl at the end of the longest night of her life. She looked at Christian Valdez and said nothing. She didn't need to. He stood, straightened his jacket. Looked once more at the corridor, the doctor disappearing back around the corner. Hannah, somewhere beyond it, stable, breathing, alive, and then moved toward the exit. He had been inside long enough. Outside, the rain had slowed. He pushed through the doors and walked toward his car and stopped, stood very still. Looked at what was waiting for him. 2 tires, flat against the wet asphalt. The windscreen, cracked in a long diagonal line. A single scratch carved across the length of the driver's door. Christian looked at the damage for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The red emergency light above the entrance, pulsing slowly across the wet roof of his car like a heartbeat. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and made a call. The call lasted 43 seconds. Christian stood beside his damaged car in the slowing rain, phone pressed to his ear, and spoke in a voice so low and level that anyone passing within 10 feet would have heard nothing useful. No anger, no volume, just words, delivered with the particular economy of a man who had learned long ago that the quieter he spoke, the more carefully people listened. When he ended the call, he put the phone back in his jacket pocket. He looked at the car once more. The cracked windscreen, the flattened tires, the long, deliberate scratch along the driver's door, not accidental, not the careless damage of someone in a hurry. This had been done slowly, intentionally. The scratch was too even, too committed to its own length, to be anything other than a message written in the only language the men who left it understood. "We know whose car this is now. We know you were here, and we are not afraid of you." Christian stood with his hands in his pockets and read the message with the expression of a man reading something he has seen many variations of before, not surprised, not rattled, simply informed. A hospital porter moved through the car park nearby, pushing an empty wheelchair toward the entrance, and glanced at Christian with the brief, assessing look of someone who registered the damaged car and the stillness of the man beside it, and decided, correctly, that this was not a situation that required his involvement. He kept walking. Christian remained where he was for a long moment. His mind was not on the car. Cars could be replaced, that was not a thought that required any particular philosophical generosity, simply a fact about the practical reality of his life. What his mind was on was the calculation that the 3 men had just made, the decision they had weighed however briefly, however stupidly, and arrived at. The conclusion they had reached that going home and reconsidering their position was a less appealing option than this. That calculation told him several things. It told him they were not frightened enough to disappear, which meant the confrontation on the forecourt, while sufficient to move them in the moment, had not revised their fundamental understanding of consequences. It told him they had access to this car park, which meant they had waited, watched him go inside, given him enough time to be occupied, then returned, deliberately, with purpose. And it told him, Most importantly, that they would go back. Not tonight, perhaps. Tonight, the sting of the forecourt was still fresh enough to keep them at a distance. But tomorrow, or the day after, or the week after, when the memory of hitting the wet asphalt had faded into the more comfortable narrative that men like them preferred to construct around their humiliations, they would return to the street, to the apartment building, to Hannah Dennis, to Jennifer. That was the calculation that mattered. Christian turned and walked back toward the hospital entrance. He pushed through the doors, crossed the corridor, and found a seat in the waiting area, not the chair beside Jennifer, who had been taken by a night shift nurse to a family room down the hall to sleep on a small cot while her mother was monitored but close enough. He sat without removing his jacket. He did not sleep. His phone lit up at 12:47. A message. 3 words and a location. He read it, put the phone face down on his knee. At 1:15, a second message. Confirmation. Christian looked at the ceiling of the waiting room for a long moment, at the white tiles, the fluorescent light, the institutional blankness of a space designed for endurance rather than comfort, and thought about the particular irony of sitting in a hospital that existed for the purpose of preserving life while making decisions of an entirely different category. He had not always been comfortable with that irony. There had been a time younger, less certain about what he was and what that meant, when the contradictions of his life had created a friction he could feel, when the gap between what he did and what he might have wished to be was a distance he measured regularly and found troubling. That time had passed. Not because he had stopped noticing the contradictions, but because he had arrived, through a long and largely ungentle education, at a working understanding of the world as it actually functioned, rather than as it was supposed to. In the world as it actually functioned, the space between the powerful and the powerless was not managed by systems designed for that purpose. It was managed, when it was managed at all, by individuals who had the means and the will to do it. He was one of those individuals. He had not chosen that. It had chosen him, in the way that certain lives choose certain people through circumstance and geography, and a series of early decisions that had compounded into an identity before he had fully understood what identity meant. But he had accepted it, and acceptance, in his experience, carried obligations. A child had grabbed his sleeve tonight. A woman had looked at him from a wall she was using to hold herself upright, and 3 men had scratched the side of his car to tell him they intended to go back. He picked up the phone, made a second call. Longer this time. He spoke for several minutes, unhurried, specific, leaving no room for interpretation or improvisation. He outlined what he wanted. He outlined what he did not want. He made the distinction between the two very clear, because in his world the distinction between those two things was the difference between a message and a catastrophe, and catastrophes were expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. When he finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Down the hall, behind a closed door, Jennifer Dennis was sleeping on a small cot, or trying to, in the exhausted, fitful way of children whose bodies have finally overpowered their minds after a night like this one. Her mother was in a room further down, monitored, stable, breathing with the careful regularity of someone whose body was being given, at last, the help it had been screaming for. They were safe. Tonight. Christian looked at his phone one last time. Then he placed it in his pocket, leaned back in the plastic chair, and waited for morning with the patience of a man who had learned that the most important moves were rarely the visible ones. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. The forecourt was still and quiet. Somewhere in the city, 3 men were about to receive a visit. They found the 3 men at a snooker hall on Berwick Street. It was the kind of place that had stopped pretending to be about snooker sometime in the previous decade. The tables still existed, 2 of them, but they functioned now primarily as furniture around which certain kinds of business were conducted, in the comfortable assumption that nobody official was paying attention. The lighting was low. The music from the corner speaker was turned just high enough to discourage the kind of conversation that carried. The man in the gray jacket, whose name was Ferris, though Christian's men had needed less than an hour to establish, that was sitting at the bar with a glass of something amber, his jacket slung over the stool beside him. He had the loosened posture of someone who had decided, somewhere between the hospital car park and this bar stool, that the evening had resolved itself adequately, that the scratched car and the slashed tires had restored a balance, that the message had been sent and received, and that was the end of it. He was wrong about that. The 2 men who entered the snooker hall at 2:43 in the morning were not loud. They did not overturn furniture or make announcements. They moved through the space with the quiet purposefulness of people who had done this before and understood that spectacle was the enemy of effectiveness. They sat down, one on either side of Ferris. He looked left, looked right, set his glass down slowly. "Relax," said the man on his left. His voice was conversational, almost friendly. "We're not here to hurt you. We're here to deliver something." Ferris said nothing. His jaw was tight. "A message," said the man on his right, "from Christian Valdez." The name landed differently in this context than it had on the hospital forecourt. On the forecourt, Ferris had not known the name, had assessed the man in the dark suit as a civilian with an unfortunate amount of capability and the poor judgment to deploy it on a stranger's behalf. An inconvenience. An obstacle to be redirected after the fact. He knew the name now. In the hours since the forecourt, the name had been spoken to him by two separate people. One of them a man whose opinion Ferris respected, and the other a man whose opinion Ferris feared, both of whom had delivered it with the same expression, the expression of someone conveying information they wished they weren't conveying. That expression, Ferris had learned tonight, was a useful barometer. "He wants you to understand something clearly," the man on his left continued, in the same unhurried tone. "The woman and the child, Hannah Dennis, Jennifer Dennis, you are done with them. The debt, whatever it was, whatever you believe is still owed, is cleared, finished, not negotiated, not deferred, gone." Ferris opened his mouth. "He's not finished," said the man on his right. Ferris closed it. "The family will be moving. You won't know where. You won't look. You won't ask. If any of the three of you, or the men you were with tonight, appear anywhere near that woman or that child, at any point, for any reason, Mr. Valdez will consider it a personal communication directed at him specifically." A pause. Deliberate. "You don't want to send that communication." The snooker hall was very quiet. The man on Ferris's left picked up his drink, looked at it briefly with mild interest, set it back down. "The car?" he added, almost as an afterthought. "The one outside the hospital tonight. You understand that was a mistake. It was not a question." Ferris understood it was not a question. "Yes," he said. The word came out smaller than he intended. "Good." The man on the left stood. The man on the right stood. They straightened their jackets in an almost synchronized movement that Ferris suspected was not coincidental. A small, deliberate echo of the man who had sent them. "Enjoy your evening," said the one on the left. They walked out. The door closed. Ferris sat at the bar for a long time without moving. The glass in front of him had stopped being interesting. The music from the corner speaker continued at its careful volume. The other man who had been present, the one in the tan shirt, seated at a table in the corner, met Ferris's eyes across the room. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing useful to say. By morning, all three men had made arrangements. Not together separately, and quickly, and with the particular efficiency of people who have received information that has dramatically simplified their decision-making process. Ferris contacted his landlord before 7 and gave notice that was not really notice so much as immediate departure dressed in the language of notice. The man in the tan shirt called his brother in a city 2 hours north. The young one in the blue hoodie who had barely slept, who had spent the night replaying the forecourt with the relentless clarity of a mind that could not find the off switch, was on a bus before 8. By 9 o'clock, none of them were on the street anymore. No public spectacle, no chaos, no bodies, no sirens, no questions that required answering. Just absence. The street registered it the way streets register these things quietly, collectively, without comment. People who lived there noticed the absence the way you notice when a persistent background sound finally stops. You don't always identify what's changed. You simply feel, in some unremarkable and reliable part of yourself, that something that had been pressing has lifted. Christian received confirmation at 8:52. He was still at the hospital. He read the message, put his phone away, and looked down the corridor toward the room where Hannah Dennis was being monitored. A nurse had passed him 20 minutes ago and told him she was awake, stable. Her blood pressure was responding well to treatment. She had asked about Jennifer, who was still sleeping in the family room, the deep, boneless sleep of a child who had finally, completely, run out of reserves. Christian had told the nurse to let her sleep. He sat in the waiting area chair and thought about the particular strange quality of this morning, the gray early light coming through the hospital windows, the smell of coffee from a machine down the hall, the ordinary sounds of an institution resuming its daily work around the extraordinary things that had happened within it the night before. He thought about Jennifer's hand on his sleeve, the specific weight and temperature of it, the trust embedded in that gesture, unearned, instinctive. the trust of a child who had run out of calculated options and had simply reached for the nearest person who was still moving toward the problem rather than away from it. He had not been reached for in that way before. He had been needed before, depended on, sought out for what he could do, and what he represented, and what his proximity guaranteed. But that was a different thing, transactional, weighted, the kind of need that understood the cost of needing, and had made its peace with that cost. Jennifer Dennis had not weighed anything. She had simply grabbed his sleeve and told him the truth, and trusted, without evidence, that it would be enough. He was not a man who examined himself often or extensively. Introspection was a luxury that his life had generally not encouraged, and he had learned to operate effectively without it. But something about this morning, the gray light, the quiet corridor, the knowledge that 3 men were gone and a woman was stable, and a child was sleeping without fear for the first time in longer than she should have needed to, something about all of it was sitting in him differently than he expected. Not loudly, just present. The way certain things are present. The way the first cold morning of autumn is present before you have a name for what the season is doing. He stood, adjusted his jacket, looked once more at the corridor. Then he walked to the family room and opened the door quietly. Jennifer was asleep on the small cot. One hand curled under her cheek, her pink cardigan folded on the chair beside her. Her face in sleep was entirely unguarded. None of the fierce, trembling determination of the forecourt, none of the careful composure of the waiting room. Just a child, sleeping. Christian stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he pulled the door closed gently and went to speak to the doctor about what Hannah Dennis would need when she was discharged. He had already decided. He just needed the details. Hannah learned the truth on the second day. She had spent the first day in the careful, suspended state of someone whose body is being repaired and whose mind is only gradually being permitted to catch up with events. The monitors beeped. The medication worked quietly through her system. Nurses came and went with the brisk, kind efficiency of people who had made a profession of keeping the worst moments of strangers' lives from becoming the last ones. Jennifer sat beside her bed for most of the afternoon, holding her hand, saying little, occasionally falling asleep in the chair, with her head on the mattress beside Hannah's arm. Hannah watched her daughter sleep, and felt something move through her that was not quite any single emotion, but contained all of them: gratitude and grief, and a love so large and so tired that she couldn't find the edges of it. She thought about the hospital entrance, about the doors that had been closed, about the man in the dark suit that Jennifer had described to her in careful, earnest detail during the hours when Hannah was awake and coherent enough to listen. Jennifer had described him the way children describe things that have made a permanent impression, specifically, and without embellishment, because the truth as she had experienced it was already remarkable enough not to require any addition. He was tall, Mum, really tall, and his hands had drawings on them, and he wasn't scared of them at all. Not even a little bit. Hannah had listened, had said the appropriate things, had tucked the information into a part of herself that she hadn't had the energy to examine yet. On the second morning, a nurse told her that her outstanding bills had been settled in full. Hannah had stared at her, asked her to repeat it. The nurse repeated it patiently and told her the name that had been given: Christian Valdez, and that was when the examining started. By the time the doctor came for morning rounds, Hannah had questions. The doctor answered what she could, which was not much, and suggested she speak to a man named Raymond who would be coming by that afternoon. Raymond was short, precise, and wore a gray suit with the unself-conscious comfort of a man who had worn gray suits every working day for 20 years. He sat in the chair beside Hannah's bed with a folder on his knee and explained things calmly and thoroughly, the way people explain things when they have been instructed to leave no room for confusion. The medical bills were settled, all of them. The outstanding rent, every penny of the accumulated debt was cleared. There was a new apartment. He provided the address. It was in a different part of the city, quieter, he said, which was the word people used when they meant safer, and Hannah understood that. On a street with a school 2 minutes' walk from the front door. Jennifer's sighs. Hannah sat very still through all of this. Raymond continued. There was also a small commercial premises, a unit on a quiet high street nearby. Lease paid for the first year. The paperwork for a grocery business had been initiated. Startup funds were available. The pace and nature of the work could be adapted around her recovery and her health requirements. He closed the folder, looked at her. Is there anything you'd like me to clarify? He asked. Hannah realized she had been holding her breath for the last 2 minutes. She released it. Why? She said. Raymond considered his answer. Mr. Valdez doesn't generally offer explanations for his decisions, he said, not unkindly. But he did ask me to tell you one thing, if you asked. Hannah waited. He said no child should have to beg for mercy. The room was very quiet. Hannah pressed her lips together, looked at the window, the gray morning light coming through it, the ordinary sky above, an ordinary street full of people going about lives that had no idea what was happening in this room. She thought about the key on the kitchen counter 2 years ago. The silence that had followed, the mounting weight of a life carried alone, the 3 men at the hospital doors, Jennifer's small hands raised and shaking in the rain. She thought about a man she had never spoken to, who had stood in a hospital corridor through the night, and then made decisions on her behalf that she hadn't known to ask for, and wouldn't have known how to ask for even if she had. A tear ran down her face. She didn't wipe it. "Tell him," she said quietly, "that I would like to thank him, in person, when I'm able." Raymond nodded, made a note, stood, straightened his gray suit jacket, and showed himself out with the same quiet efficiency with which he had arrived. Jennifer appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, cardigan on, shoes on the wrong feet, hair still carrying the impression of the hospital pillow. "Mum, you're crying." "I know, baby. Is it bad crying or good crying?" Hannah looked at her daughter, this small, fierce, exhausted, extraordinary child who had stood in the rain and refused to give up, and felt the smile arrive before she had decided to produce it. "Good," she said. "Come here." Jennifer crossed the room in 4 steps and climbed carefully onto the bed beside her mother, slotting herself into the space under Hannah's arm with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this her whole life. Hannah held her. They stayed like that for a long time. Outside, the city went on being itself, loud and indifferent and enormous and occasionally, unexpectedly, capable of this. Hannah closed her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, the weight was not there. The new apartment smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Jennifer noticed the smell the moment Hannah pushed open the door, clean and sharp, and entirely unlike the damp, familiar heaviness of the old building on the old street. She stepped inside ahead of her mother, moving through the small entrance hall into the living room, turning slowly in the middle of it with her arms slightly out at her sides, the way children turn when they are trying to physically measure a space against their feelings about it. The floors were light. The windows were large. Through the main one, Jennifer could see a street that had trees on it, actual trees, in a row, still carrying the last of their leaves in the pale morning light. She had not lived on a street with trees before. "It's quiet," she said. "Yes," Hannah said from the doorway, one hand on the frame, taking it in. "I can hear birds." "I know." Jennifer turned to look at her mother. Hannah was leaning against the doorframe in the careful way she had learned to lean against things during the recovery, not from weakness anymore, but from a habit the body had formed during the weeks when weakness was real and had not yet fully unlearned. She looked different. Not entirely. The last 2 years had left marks that didn't disappear in a matter of days. But her color had returned. Her eyes had the quality of someone who had slept, who had eaten regularly, who had taken her medication at the right time every single day because it was no longer a choice being made between 2 unaffordable necessities. She looked like a version of herself that Jennifer recognized from a long time ago. The grocery shop opened on a Tuesday. It was small, 2 rooms, a counter, shelves that Hannah had stocked herself over the preceding days with a careful, particular attention that Jennifer recognized as her mother's way of making something hers. She had arranged things the way she wanted them, labeled things in her own handwriting, chosen which things went near the door, which things went at the back, based on logic she had worked out herself and explained to Jennifer at length during the stocking process. Jennifer had listened to all of it, seriously, as though she were being briefed on matters of genuine strategic importance, which, she had decided, she was. The first customer arrived 11 minutes after opening. An older woman from 2 streets over, who had seen the sign going up the previous week and had been waiting. She bought bread and milk and a small jar of honey, and she said the shop was lovely, and Hannah had thanked her and meant it in a way that went considerably beyond the transaction. By midday there had been 7 customers. By the end of the first day, Hannah had sat at the counter after closing, looked at the numbers in her notebook, and been very still for a long moment. Then she had called Jennifer over and shown her the page. Jennifer had studied it carefully. "Is that good?" "Yes," Hannah said. "That's good. Can I work here sometimes?" "You have school. After school." Hannah had looked at her daughter, this child who had grown, somehow, across the previous weeks, not in height, but in some less measurable dimension, and said yes. Christian Valdez came on the third day. He didn't come inside immediately. He stood on the pavement across the street for a while, looking at the shop front, the sign above the door, the arranged window display, the light inside with the expression of a man checking something against an internal register. Confirming that what he had set in motion had arrived at what he intended, Jennifer saw him first. She was arranging a lower shelf near the window and looked up through the glass and recognized him immediately. The height, the stillness, the dark jacket, and felt something move through her chest that was warm and complicated and not entirely nameable. She stood up, went to the door, opened it. He looked at her from across the street. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the width of the quiet road between them, the morning air cold and clear. Then Jennifer stepped onto the pavement. She walked across to him in the careful, deliberate way she had walked toward him on the hospital forecourt, not running, not hesitating, just moving, purposefully, as though the distance were something that needed to be crossed, and she had already decided to cross it. She stopped in front of him, looked up. He looked down. "The shop opened on Tuesday," she said. "I know." Mom cried when she counted the money at the end of the first day. "But the good kind." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "Good." Jennifer looked at him for a long moment, with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise what she is thinking. "People say things about you," she said. "On the street, at school, I've heard them." Christian held her gaze. "I know what people say." "I don't think it's the whole truth," Jennifer said simply. "The truth is what I saw. And what I saw was you walking toward us, when everyone else walked the other way." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. The words were small and entirely sincere, and landed with the specific weight that only wholly unperformed gratitude ever carries. Christian looked at her for a long moment. "Take care of your mother," he said quietly. "I will." He nodded once, turned. Jennifer watched him walk back toward his car, unhurried, the same measured step as always, the dark jacket carrying the morning light across its shoulders. He didn't look back. She stood on the pavement until the car had turned the corner and the street was quiet again. Then she turned back toward the shop. Through the window, she could see Hannah behind the counter, serving a customer, head bent slightly in conversation, hands moving with the easy competence of a woman doing something she had chosen. Jennifer crossed the street, pushed open the door. The bell above it rang. Hannah looked up and smiled. He wasn't the monster they said he was. He was the man who showed up. "Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.